Astral Sleep Stories, the Vale of Undying Stars. A fantasy sleep story. Welcome to Astral Sleep Stories. I'm so glad you found your way here tonight, to this quiet place, this gentle corner of the world, where the only thing asked of you is that you let go. Let go of the day. Let go of the lists and the noise and the weight of every hour that has passed since morning. All of that is behind you now, and ahead of you is only rest. Take a slow breath in through your nose and feel your chest and belly rise gently with it. Hold it just a moment at the top, just a heartbeat, and then let it go. Let the exhale be long and unhurried and completely your own. Good. And again, breathe in, drawing in something calm and clean, and then breathe out, releasing everything that no longer serves this moment. You don't have to think. You don't have to remember anything. You only have to breathe and listen and let the words carry you somewhere soft and very, very far away. Tonight's story takes place in a world that has no name in any living tongue, though it was old before names were fashionable. It is a world where the mountains remember their own making, where rivers sing quiet songs to the stones on their beds, and where the stars, oh the stars, are not merely lights scattered across the dark, but something closer to living things, patient and ancient and endlessly kind. It is a world where the land breathes, and the trees think long, slow thoughts that span centuries, and where a single evening can hold more beauty than most mortals encounter in a lifetime. In this world there is a valley, and in that valley, tonight, something is about to begin. Part 1. The Valley of Eravel. In the folded heart of a mountain range, so old that its peaks had worn themselves smooth with ages of wind and rain and silence, there lay a valley called Eravel. It was not a wide valley, nor an especially long one, but it was deep in the way that certain special places are deep. Not in measurement, but in meaning. In the way that a place feels as though it has been waiting for you, specifically, even before you knew it existed. The mountains on either side of Eravel rose in great curving walls of pale grey stone streaked through with veins of silver that caught the light at dawn and at dusk, and turned the cliffs into something that resembled the pages of an ancient illuminated manuscript, all silver script on grey parchment, written in no language anyone had ever learned to read, but beautiful for that very reason. The stone was cool to the touch, even in summer, and smooth in the places where centuries of weather had polished it to something close to glass. If you pressed your palm flat against the cliff face in the early morning, you could feel a faint and steady vibration beneath the stone. Not quite a sound, not quite a heartbeat, but something in between. The old ones who had once lived in Eravel believed it was the mountain remembering itself, dreaming, perhaps, of the time before it was a mountain, when it was only pressure and heat and the slow ambition of the earth. The floor of the valley was carpeted in deep moss, not the thin, flat, incidental moss you might find on a damp stone wall, but the thick, luxuriant, cushioning kind that grows in places where no foot has disturbed it for a very long time. It was the color of deep water when sunlight reaches into it, that particular blue-green that exists somewhere between color and light, and when you walked upon it, your feet sank in just slightly, as though the valley floor itself was offering a gentle welcome. The moss grew up and around the roots of the trees, which were broad and gnarled and dark with age, and it climbed the lower portions of the cliff walls, and it pooled in the hollows and depressions of the ground like green water that had forgotten how to flow. Through the center of Eravel ran a river, and the river had a voice. Not a roaring voice, not a rushing and urgent voice, but a murmuring, contemplative one. The voice of something that has seen a great deal and is in no hurry to get anywhere. The river was called the Aven, and the Aven moved in wide, unhurried loops across the valley floor, doubling back on itself in great slow curves, as though reluctant to leave any part of the valley unvisited. Its water was extraordinarily clear, so clear that even where it ran 3 or 4 feet deep, you could see every individual stone on the riverbed, every drift of sand, every small silver fish moving in the current like a thought that had not yet become a word. The sound it made was layered and complex in the way that music is layered and complex. There was a deep underlying murmur, steady and low, beneath which you could hear the lighter ripple of water across shallower stones. And above that, now and then, a bright momentary sound, like a single note struck on a glass instrument when a small wave broke against a larger rock. To sit beside the Aven for even a few minutes was to feel the particular kind of peace that is not the absence of thought, but the slowing of it, the way thoughts begin to move at the pace of water rather than the pace of worry. There were trees in Eravel, though they were not like trees you might know from other places. They were called the Silvaneth in the old tongue, a word that translated poorly, but meant something close to those who remember the sky. The Silvaneth were tall and very old, with trunks so wide that it would take 4 people joining hands to encircle one, and their bark was the color of warm ash, a pale silver gray that darkened to charcoal at the base of each tree and lightened almost to white near the upper branches. Their leaves were unlike ordinary leaves. They were long and narrow, like the leaves of a willow, but semi-translucent, so that when the sun shone through them, they glowed with a soft, diffused, greenish-golden light, as though each leaf were a tiny lamp. In autumn, if there had been an autumn in Eravel, the leaves might have turned gold or red. But in Eravel, the seasons moved gently and did not fully commit to change. The valley existed in a kind of perpetual late summer, early autumn, warm enough for comfort, cool enough for reflection, the light always having that particular quality of richness that belongs to the turning year. The Silvaneth did not merely stand in Eravel the way trees stand in other forests, static, passive, background. They seemed, when the wind moved through them, to be engaged in something. Their branches stirred in patterns that didn't always match the direction of the breeze, as though they were gesturing to one another in a language of motion. Their roots, where they surfaced above the ground, were arranged in such flowing, almost deliberate shapes that they might have been the work of some patient sculptor who had decided to depict rivers in wood. And in the evenings, when the sun dropped below the mountain walls and the valley filled with a long, blue-green dusk, the Silvaneth gave off a very faint luminescence, not enough to read by, not enough to cast shadows, but enough to perceive, especially if you were not looking directly at it. A soft, residual glow, as though the trees were slowly releasing the light they had absorbed during the day, back into the air around them. It was into this valley, on an evening in the long and golden season that the valley kept for itself, that a traveler came. Her name was Eryn, and she had been walking for a very long time. Part 2. The Traveler. Eryn was not a young woman, though she was not old either. She existed in that spacious middle territory of life where youth has released its particular urgency, but age has not yet arrived to press its own claims. Her hair was dark and streaked with grey at the temples in a way that suited her, like the silver veins in the valley's cliff walls. Her eyes were grey as well, the precise grey of river water in overcast light, and they had the quality of eyes that have seen a great deal and found most of it interesting. She wore a long coat of deep green-brown, the color of forest undergrowth, and it was worn at the cuffs and faded in patches in the way that a coat gets when it has been truly useful for many years. She carried a walking staff of pale wood, ash perhaps or something like it, that she had worn smooth in the hand over long miles of road. Her boots were the kind of boots that have forgotten what it felt like to be new. On her back she carried a pack that was neither large nor small, packed with the particular efficiency of someone who has learned through experience exactly what they need and what they do not. She moved through the entrance of the valley, a narrow defile between two great shoulders of stone, barely wide enough for two to walk abreast, with the unhurried gait of someone who has learned that all destinations are reached more fully when you pay attention to the journey. She had heard of Eravel. Most people who traveled in the old lands had heard of it, in the way that you hear of certain places that are spoken of in hushed and careful voices, with a quality of reverence that distinguishes them from merely beautiful places. Eravel was not merely beautiful. It was, people said, and people were right, one of those places in the world that seems to exist at a slightly different register than the rest of reality. More present, more itself. As though the land there has not been diluted by time and changed the way most land eventually is. When Eryn stepped through the narrow entrance and the valley opened before her, she stopped. She had expected something. She had not expected this. The light in Eravel at this hour, the deep blue gold of late evening, fell on everything with a quality of attention. That was the only word that came to her. Attention. As though the light was not merely illuminating but noticing. The moss at her feet glowed with it. The pale trunks of the Silvaneth absorbed it and gave it back changed, warmer. The river, which she could hear before she could see it, murmured its complicated music somewhere ahead and to her left. And above the river the last motes of light caught in the translucent leaves of the trees and turned them into something very close to stained glass in an old chapel, colored and quiet and full of a meaning you felt rather than understood. She breathed in. The air of Eravel tasted of green things, of water, of earth that has been undisturbed for long enough that it has developed its own deep and complex character. There was something else in it as well. A faint note she could not name. Something resinous and ancient and sweet, like the smell of old wood in a room that has been closed for a century and then opened onto summer. She walked forward into the valley. The moss received her footsteps softly. The trees rose around her, their branches interweaving overhead in a canopy that was not solid but was layered, so that the sky above her was visible in shifting pieces. Deep violet now, darkening toward the blue-black of true evening, and in it, though it was not yet fully dark, the first stars beginning to appear. In Eravel, the stars came early. Part 3. The Cottage by the Aven. She found the cottage before she found the fire, which seemed backward, but was in fact the correct order of things in Eravel, where small surprises arrived regularly and without apology. The cottage was built against the base of the eastern cliff wall, where a great overhang of stone formed a natural partial roof that the builder had incorporated cleverly into the structure itself. The walls were made of the valley's own stone. That pale grey rock, the blocks fitted together without mortar in the old way, each piece chosen to interlock with its neighbors with such precision that the whole wall breathed as a single thing. The roof, where it was not the stone overhang above, was thatched with something Eryn didn't immediately recognize. Long, pale reeds, she thought, though they had a silver sheen to them that reeds don't usually have, and they lay in such smooth and even courses that the whole roof had a sculptural quality, like a beautiful piece of craft rather than merely a practical necessity. The windows of the cottage were small and round-topped and glowed warmly from within, and the door was made of dark wood, banded with iron that had long since aged past rust into a deep, stable, charcoal grey. Beside the door, a climbing plant with small, pale flowers wound its way up and around the doorframe and along the edge of the stone wall, and the flowers, whatever they were just slightly luminescent in the gathering dark, the same faint, self-contained glow that the Silvaneth displayed, but smaller, quieter, like individual stars that had chosen to anchor themselves in something living. Eryn stood before the cottage door and considered it. It did not look entirely empty. The light in the windows was too warm for a place long abandoned. She knocked. The silence that followed was not the silence of an empty house. It was the silence of someone deciding. Then the door opened. The one who opened it was old in the way that certain things are old. Not frail, not diminished, but settled. Completely and thoroughly themselves, in the way that takes a very long time to achieve. He was tall, and his shoulders were broad beneath a long robe the color of deep grey river water, and his hair and beard were white, not the yellow white of age, but the clean, pure white of fresh snow or quartz crystal. His eyes were the color of the valley at dusk, that particular blue-green that was not quite one color and not quite the other, and they held, in their depths, the unhurried quality of someone who has nowhere to be except exactly here. He looked at Eryn for a long moment, and she looked back at him, and then he smiled. It was a slow smile, the kind that starts at the eyes and reaches the mouth only after due consideration. "You've come a long way," he said. His voice was deep and unhurried, like the Aven. "I have," said Eryn. "Come in then," he said. "The fire is good tonight." His name, she learned, was Carador. He had lived in the valley for longer than he found it useful to specify, and he found this answer sufficient. He was a keeper of sorts, though what he kept exactly took several hours of conversation to begin to understand. He kept the valley's stories. He kept its history. He kept, in a more literal sense, the great stone shelves along 3 walls of his cottage that held hundreds of volumes, some bound in leather, some in cloth, some in materials Eryn could not identify, and dozens of scrolls in wooden cases and stacks of loose pages held together with cord, and clay tablets incised with writing so small and fine that she could not read it without leaning very close. But this is getting ahead. First, there was the fire. Part 4, the fire and the first story. The inside of the cottage was larger than it appeared from without, in the way that truly well-made interior spaces can be. The ceilings were high, higher than you'd expect given the modest exterior, and the walls were warm with the accumulated breath of years of habitation, the smell of old books, of wood smoke, of dried herbs hanging in bunches from the rafters, of tea, of something baked long ago that had left its ghost pleasantly in the air. The fire burned in a hearth of river stone that occupied nearly one entire wall of the main room. It was a generous fire, built up properly with large logs at the back and smaller ones in front, and it had reached that particular stage of burning where it had settled into itself, no longer crackling and ambitious, but deep and steady and producing more heat than light, though the light it gave was the best kind of light. Orange gold and alive and full of movement, making shadows dance on the walls and ceiling in slow, unfrightening ways, and catching the spines of the books on the shelves, so that the room seemed to be lined not with paper and leather, but with something more like embers. Carador set a kettle on the fire and gestured to a wide, cushioned chair beside the hearth, and Eryn sat. The chair held her comfortably. She set her staff against the wall and let the warmth of the fire begin its slow work on her tired limbs, the particular cellular warmth of a fire that gets into your bones in a way that no other heat quite manages. "You have come because of the veil," Carador said, not as a question, setting out 2 cups on a low table of smooth, dark wood. "I have come because of the stars," Eryn said. "I was told that in Eravel, the stars are different." Carador poured water into the cups. It had come to a boil with a swiftness that seemed slightly improbable, and the steam that rose was fragrant with something floral and green. He carried both cups to the fireside and handed one to Eryn, then settled into the chair opposite, which was equally wide and deep, and which accepted him with the ease of something that has accommodated the same presence for a very long time. "Different?" he said, and considered the word. "Not different from what they are, only different from what most people understand them to be." He wrapped both hands around his cup and looked into the fire for a moment. "Let me tell you something about this valley before you see what it shows you at night. It will help you understand." Eryn sipped her tea. It was extraordinary, gentle and complex, and warming in the particular way that good tea warms from the inside out and unhurried about it. She settled deeper into the chair. "Long ago," Carador began, in a voice that was perfectly suited to long ago, a voice that seemed to have been made for the purpose. "Before this valley had a name, before the mountains had worn themselves to these shapes, there were people who lived differently from the way people live now. They did not separate the sky from the earth in their understanding. They did not think of the stars as something distant and separate from the world they walked on. They believed, and I would not say they were wrong, that the stars were not above the world, but within it. That every stone, every river, every tree and creature carried within it a piece of the same light that burned in the heavens. That the world below and the world above were not 2 worlds, but 1 world, breathing in and out." He paused, and the fire breathed in the pause. "They built nothing here," he continued. "They left no monuments, no carved stones, no ruins. This was deliberate. They believed that to mark a sacred place with permanence was to diminish it, to say that the sacredness was there and not here, in this fixed location, rather than in the land itself. So they left it as they found it. They loved it, and they left it, and they trusted the love to linger." He looked at Eryn then, and there was something in his eyes that was very old and not at all sad. "The love lingered," he said simply. Part 5. The Walking of the Valley. Eryn slept well that night in a small room at the back of the cottage, in a bed that was made of the same dark wood as everything else in the house, heaped with coverings of wool and linen, and she did not dream, which was itself a kind of gift. She woke to the sound of the Aven and the distant, clear call of some bird she didn't know, a high 3-note sound that descended from its first note to its last in a way that managed to sound both questioning and content. The morning of Eravel was a revelation. She dressed quietly and went outside, and the valley in morning light was entirely a different thing from the valley in evening light, the way the same piece of music played in a different key becomes somehow new without ceasing to be itself. The mist had come down overnight from the mountain walls and lay across the valley floor in long, low ribbons that moved slowly in a very slight breeze, so that the world appeared to be unspooling at a gentle pace, revealing itself gradually, not all at once. The moss was wet with dew and caught the early light in thousands of tiny points, so that the valley floor looked as though someone had scattered glass dust across it in the night. The Silvaneth rose from the mist, with their pale trunks catching the gold of the low morning sun, and their translucent leaves not yet fully lit, still a soft, smoky green, waiting for the sun to climb higher and wake their color. The Aven was audible but not yet visible. The mist covered it, and the sound of the river rose through the mist like something elemental, like the voice of the ground itself. She walked, following no path. There were no paths in Eravel, and the moss was so resilient that it sprang back after each footstep as though nothing had passed, simply walking in the direction that felt right, which was the direction of the river. The mist was cool against her face, not cold, and it had a quality of softness, like moving through something that was not quite air and not quite water, but something in between. She breathed it in and felt it settle in her lungs as something clean. The Aven came into view as the mist began to thin, and she stopped at its bank and looked down into it. The water was, if anything, even clearer in the morning than it had appeared the evening before. She could see into it with an almost uncomfortable intimacy. Every grain of sand on the riverbed, every pebble, every tendril of waterlogged plant material moving in the slow current with a kind of underwater grace. Two small fish, pale silver, almost white, held themselves in the current just below the surface, their tails working with the minimum movement necessary to maintain their position, perfectly still in everything except that small, constant motion. They regarded her, she felt, without particular alarm, as though they had long since concluded that the world above the water was not their concern. She sat on the bank. The moss there, at the water's edge, was even deeper and softer than it was elsewhere, almost impossibly so, as though the river had encouraged it for years to grow with particular generosity at this spot. She sat and let her hands rest in her lap and looked at the water, and let her mind do what the Aven suggested, which was to slow down. It was remarkable how quickly it obeyed. She had not realized, until this moment of stillness in this particular place, how long it had been since her thoughts had moved at this pace. Not the frantic pace of worry, not the focused pace of problem-solving, but this loose, unhurried drift, one thought arriving and departing at a speed that allowed you to actually notice it, to see its shape and color and weight before it gave way to the next one. It was not the absence of thought. It was thought at its most natural, the way thought was before the world asked it to be so much faster and so much louder than its nature required. She sat by the Aven for a long time. When she finally stood and turned back toward the cottage, the mist had lifted entirely, and the valley was fully revealed in late morning light, and she understood, standing there with the river at her back, and the trees around her, and the cliff walls rising on either side into a sky of very deep, clear blue. She understood why this place was spoken of in quiet voices. It was not that Eravel was magical in the way of stories, where magic is a force that does things, moves things, changes things through the application of power. It was magical in the older sense, the sense that preceded that understanding, the sense of a place that is more completely and thoroughly itself than any other place you have encountered, and in being so, makes you feel more completely and thoroughly yourself. She walked back to the cottage for breakfast, and Carador had made bread, and it was warm. Part 6. The Library of Old Things. In the afternoon, when the light was at its fullest and poured through the small round windows of the cottage in solid-seeming bars of gold, Carador showed Eryn the library. She had been aware of the books since she arrived. It would have been impossible not to be, given that they occupied 3 of the 4 walls from floor to ceiling, broken only by windows, and the shelves that held other things, smaller things, stones and pieces of wood, and folded documents and sealed cases of the kind that held something fragile within. But she had not yet been invited to examine them closely, and she had the sense that in this place, as in others, there was a proper time for things. And this was now the proper time. Carador moved through his library with the ease of someone who knows every object it contains, not just by category but individually, who has handled each thing enough times that the handling has become part of the thing's identity, left some impression of itself in the paper, or the binding, or the clay. He did not use a catalogue or an index. He simply walked to the shelf he meant to visit and took down what he intended to take down, which suggested an organization of some kind, though not one that would have been visible to anyone else. "This one," he said, setting a volume on the wide, smooth work table in the center of the room. It was bound in leather the color of dried oak leaves, and the leather was soft and very old, and the boards of the binding were beginning to bow slightly at their edges with the accumulated weight of many years of humidity and handling. On the cover, pressed into the leather in a design that might once have been gold-gilded, but was now merely impressed upon the surface, was the image of a tree. One tree, depicted with its roots below the ground line and its branches above, the roots and branches nearly symmetrical, nearly mirror images of each other, so that the whole formed a kind of circle. "What is it?" Eryn asked. "A record of the valley," Carador said. "Or one of them. There are several." He opened the book to a page somewhere in its first third. The writing was small and careful, and in a hand that had begun with great precision, and then, over the duration of writing, had relaxed somewhat, so that the later entries had a more natural and individual quality. The same hand, the same person, but a person who had become less self-conscious over the course of the writing. This was kept by a woman who came here, as you have, looking for something. She stayed for 12 years. "What was she looking for?" Eryn asked. "Herself," Carador said, without irony or sentiment, as though this were the most straightforward and reasonable thing a person could be looking for. She found her way there, eventually. The valley helped. Eryn looked at the writing on the open page. She could not read the language. It was not one she knew, but the quality of the handwriting itself communicated something. There was a care in it, in the later sections especially, that was not anxiety, but attention. The writer had learned to pay attention. You could see it in the strokes. "What does this part say?" she asked. Carador leaned down and looked at the page. His lips moved slightly, translating to himself before he spoke aloud. "She writes," he said, "I have come to understand that the valley does not give anything that was not already here. It only removes what was covering it. I feel this morning, standing by the river, that I am being slowly and gently uncovered, like a stone in a stream from which the silt is being washed away. I am not becoming something new. I am becoming what I was before I forgot." The room was quiet for a moment. "She writes well," Eryn said. "She wrote better as time went on," Carador said. "Most things do," given the right conditions. He showed her other books after that, records and accounts and what he called the memory texts, which were something between history and story, something between fact and dream, written in a mode of understanding that did not sharply distinguish between things that happened and things that were felt to happen, on the grounds that the distinction, though useful in many practical contexts, was not the only way of knowing. There were books of observations, weather, and the patterns of stars, and the behavior of the Silvaneth through different seasons, and the movements of creatures in the valley. There were books that were almost entirely images, not illustrations in the decorative sense, but something more like maps, though maps of things that were not geographic, maps of some other kind of territory. One of these, a book of thick, heavy pages, on each of which a single image was drawn in finely ground pigments that had kept their color with extraordinary fidelity over what Carador said was several hundred years, stopped her entirely. Each page showed a pattern of stars, not a constellation in the modern sense, not a named grouping imposed on the sky by convention, but a configuration, a relationship between particular stars that seemed to have been observed and recorded with great care and specificity. Beneath each pattern was a description in the old language, and beside the description, in a different hand, were annotations in 3 other languages, each a translation, or an interpretation, or an elaboration of what the original text had said. "What are these?" she asked. "The stars of Eravel," Carador said, "as they appear from the valley floor, from a specific point beside the river, on specific nights. The configurations change through the year, and the book records a full cycle. One configuration for each of the 32 named nights that the valley keeps." 32, she said. "The valley does not follow the calendar of other places," he said. "It has its own sense of when a new night begins and what kind of night it is." He smiled the slow smile. "Tonight is one of them." Part 7. The Undying Stars. The sky above Eravel was not the sky above anywhere else. Eryn understood this as soon as she stepped out of the cottage that night and looked up, and she understood it not merely as an intellectual observation, but as a physical sensation, a feeling in her chest that was not quite emotion and not quite awe, but something beneath both of those, something that was simply the body recognizing something it had not seen before, and responding with the particular alertness that the truly new provokes. The stars were not brighter than stars elsewhere. They were not larger or more numerous, but they were more present, more dimensional, in a way that stars from other places, however clear the night, did not usually manage to be. They were not flat points on a flat dome. They were deep. They existed at different depths, as though the sky above Eravel were not a surface but a volume, and you were seeing into it the way you could see into the Aven by day, the nearer stars and the farther stars not collapsed onto the same plane, but honestly, visibly, at their different removes from where you stood. She had never seen the sky this way. She had not known the sky could look this way. Carador stood beside her, his white hair and his pale robe catching the starlight, so that he himself appeared faintly luminescent. The way the Silvaneth were faintly luminescent. The way the small flowers beside his cottage door were faintly luminescent. Everything in Eravel that was old enough and patient enough glowed softly in the dark. "There," he said, and pointed not to a specific star, but to a region of the sky, the northern quadrant, where the stars were particularly dense, where the light between the stars was not merely dark, but had a quality of depth and color to it a faint and very deep blue that was almost purple, a color that had no name she knew but that felt deeply familiar, the way certain colors in dreams feel familiar. "What am I looking at?" she said softly. She did not want to speak at full volume. The night felt like something that should not be disturbed. "You are looking at what those people looked at," Carador said, equally softly. "The ones I told you of this evening. The ones who lived here before memory. They called it the star field of the living, which in their language was a single word with no separate translation for each of its components." He paused. "They believed that the stars in that part of the sky didn't die, that they had been burning since before the world was made and would burn until after it was finished, and that in between they gave their light not to the sky but through it, down into the world below, into every stone, every river, every living thing. That what you see when you look at a tree in moonlight, or at a river, or at a sleeping face, is in part that light, come down through the ages and taken up into the world." She looked at the star field of the living. It did not look, from this vantage, like a thing that dies. "They are not undying in the sense of immortal," Carador continued. "They will end, as all fires end. But they burn on a scale of time so vast that within any human understanding, within any scale we can meaningfully imagine, they simply do not stop. They are the closest thing in the visible world to permanence. And permanence, looked at directly, is a restful thing." She looked at the stars for a long time. The Aven murmured somewhere in the dark. The Silvaneth breathed around her, their leaves moving in a barely perceptible breeze and catching the starlight and releasing it in slow, shifting patterns on the valley floor. Carador did not speak again for a while, and she was glad. Some things should be met in silence. Part 8. What the stars are made of. Later, sitting by the fire again, which had been built up in their absence to something warm and quiet and steady, Carador spoke of what he called the deep nature of the stars above the valley, and Eryn listened with the particular quality of attention that the fire and the tea and the night sky had cultivated in her over the course of the day. "It is not," he said, looking into the fire rather than at her, which was the right way to talk about certain things, "that the stars are sentient. Not in the way that you and I are sentient. They do not think or feel or choose. But they have nature. They have character in the way that a river has character. Not because the river decides to have it, but because the river is what it is. And being what it is for long enough, it expresses itself with a consistency that amounts to character." He picked up the fire poker and adjusted a log, unhurriedly, giving the fire his attention for a moment before continuing. "The ancient people of this valley were not wrong when they said the light of those stars is in the world. They were speaking, I think, of something that is technically true in a way they could not have articulated in the terms we might use now, that the materials of the world and the materials of the stars are, at their foundation, the same materials. That the stones of this valley and the fires above it are made, ultimately, of the same stuff, in different arrangements and at different scales and temperatures. That everything, if you go back far enough, is continuous with everything else." He paused again. "This is a fact that is known and forgotten and rediscovered over and over in the history of human understanding," he said. "And it is the kind of fact that can be held in two ways. As a piece of information, which changes nothing, or as a living understanding, which changes everything. The people who lived in this valley held it as the second kind. They felt themselves to be related, genuinely, materially, not merely metaphorically, to the stars above their valley. And that feeling, held long enough and deeply enough, produces a particular quality of peace. "Because you cannot be lost," Eryn said, and was surprised that she said it, because she hadn't known she was thinking it. Carador looked at her then, and the firelight was in his eyes. "Because you cannot be lost," he confirmed. "When you understand that you are not a visitor in the world, but a part of it, not passing through it, but made of it, continuous with it. The particular fear that drives most human restlessness, the fear of being somehow outside, somehow separate, somehow alien to the very ground you walk on, that fear begins to release its hold." He set down the fire poker. "This valley assists the process. It is very old and very patient, and it has been practicing this particular kind of peace for a very long time." The fire burned. The Aven murmured beyond the walls. "Why did you come here?" he asked her. She thought for a moment. Then she said, "I think for the same reason she did. The woman who kept the record." Carador nodded. He did not say anything else. He only picked up his cup and drank his tea, and let the fire do the rest of the talking, which it did, in its wordless and ancient language of heat and light and the slow, steady consumption of one thing into another. Part 9. The Night's Long Dreaming. She walked out again before she slept, one final time to stand beneath the stars. The valley was different again now. The third face it had shown her, after the face of evening and the face of morning. This was the face of deep night, and it was both the simplest and the most complex. Simple because the dark had reduced everything to its essential elements, the pale trunks of the Silvaneth rising from the black moss, the glimmer of the Aven in the starlight, the shapes of the mountains against the deeper black of the sky. Complex because in the dark, the other qualities of the valley, the ones that didn't depend on light, became more apparent. The sound of the river, the breath of the trees, the smell of moss and water, and something older than both, that deep and unnamed scent she'd noticed when she entered the valley, which was stronger now, as though the night released more of it than the day. And above everything, the stars. She stood in the center of the valley floor, or what felt like the center, though she could not have said why. And she tipped her head back and looked up, and the starfield of the living was directly above her. From this angle, with the dark walls of the mountains on either side drawing her gaze upward, the sky above the valley appeared to be a window. Not a metaphorical window, not a figure of speech, but something that looked, genuinely, as though the stone above her had opened and revealed what lay beyond it. A window into the depth and breadth of everything. The stars at their different depths, the faint color between them, the sense of looking not at a surface, but into a volume of almost incomprehensible extent. She breathed in. She breathed out. And something that she had been carrying, something she had been carrying for so long that she had stopped noticing its weight, began, slowly and quietly and without drama, to set itself down. It did not vanish. These things do not vanish, but it rested where it had not rested before. She stood beneath the stars of Eravel, and she felt, not happiness exactly, not contentment in the usual sense, but something deeper than either of those. She felt the particular peace of understanding, even briefly, that she was not separate from any of this, not separate from the stars above, or the moss below, or the old stone of the mountains, or the clear and murmuring river, or the trees that breathed and glowed. She was of a piece with all of it. made of the same ancient fire, rearranged into this particular form, moving through the world for a short while in this particular shape. And then, in time, in the fullness of the great long time that the stars measured, returning to what she had always been. It was the most restful thought she had ever had. She stood there until the cold of the night air suggested she had stood long enough, and then she walked back to the cottage, and she went to her small room, and she pulled the covers of wool and linen over herself, and the sound of the Aven came through the walls, and the stars, she knew, burned on outside the window, patient and bright and very, very old. She closed her eyes, and Eravel held her as the valley held all things that came into it with an open hand, gently, warmly, without condition, without urgency. And she slept. Part 10. The morning of leaving. Days passed in Eravel. She lost count of them, which felt correct. The valley did not encourage counting. It encouraged noticing, which is a different activity entirely, and one that has very different effects on the spirit. She walked every morning along the banks of the Aven. She sat beneath the Silvaneth and felt the faint warmth of their slow, residual luminescence even by day. A warmth that was more quality than temperature, more felt than measured. She helped Carador in his library, not reading. She still could not read the old languages, but listening as he read aloud, translating as he went, the records and observations and memory texts of people who had known this valley across the long centuries of its keeping. She learned the names of things. The three-note bird was called the morning caller, a translation of a word in the ancient language that also meant one who announces the continuity of things. The pale silver fish in the Aven were called the undisturbed, for reasons that seemed self-evident once you had watched them hold their positions in the current for an hour or more without apparent effort. The climbing plant beside the cottage door, the one with the luminescent flowers, was called the keeping vine, and it bloomed only in places that had been held in peace for long enough. She asked Carador what long enough meant in this context. He considered. Longer than a human life, he said. Usually much longer. She looked at the vine for a moment. But there are other ways of keeping a place, she said. He smiled. There are, he said. Love is faster than time in some ways. It can accomplish what time alone would take centuries to do. The two of them together are very powerful. On the morning of her leaving, which she knew was the morning of her leaving, not because she had decided it intellectually, but because she woke and felt it, the way you feel the end of certain things, she sat one last time by the Aven. The mist was down again, as it had been on her first morning, and the river moved through it with the same unhurried certainty it always moved with. She thought about what Carador had told her, about the people who had lived here long ago, who had believed themselves to be continuous with the stars, who had built nothing and left no monuments, but trusted that love would linger. She thought about the woman who had kept the record, who had written about being uncovered like a stone in a stream, becoming what she was before she forgot. She thought about what she was before she forgot. The river gave her no answers, but it gave her something better. The quiet in which answers, when they were ready, could arrive at their own pace. She stood and touched the bark of the nearest Silvaneth, felt its cool smoothness, felt the faint vibration beneath it, the mountains dreaming in miniature. And then she walked back to the cottage for the last time. Carador had breakfast waiting. He did not ask if she was ready to leave, because people who live in valleys like Eravel know that asking that question is somewhat beside the point. She ate, and they talked, easily and slowly, the way they had talked over several days now, in the way of two people who have found the comfortable pace of each other's thought. When she had put on her coat and her pack and taken up her staff, she stood in the doorway and looked at him. "Will I remember it?" she asked. "Clearly. When I am somewhere else, far from here, will it stay clear?" He looked at her with those blue-green eyes, and the smile was in them before it reached anywhere else. "The valley does not stay clear," he said. "It stays present. That is different. You will not always be able to describe it precisely, but it will be there." He paused. "The way you know you have dreamed, even when you cannot remember the dream. You carry it." She nodded. She believed him. She walked out through the narrow defile between the great stone shoulders, back into the world beyond the valley. And the world beyond the valley received her differently than it had before. The same road, the same light, the same ordinary miles, but moved through differently now, with some quality of patience she had not had before, with some quality of steadiness that was new in the way that things rediscovered are new, not unfamiliar, but freshly available. Behind her, in the valley, the Aven moved. The Silvaneth breathed. The keeping vine flowered gently in the morning light. And the stars, though the morning sky showed no stars, burned on above the world, as they had burned before the world was made, patient and bright and undying, and full of a light that, as those ancient people had understood, was never entirely separate from the world it fell upon. It was in the stones. It was in the rivers. It was in every living thing. It was in you now, as you have been lying here, listening. Rest in that, if you can. You are not separate from any of this. Close your eyes and let the valley hold you. You are drifting now, deeper and deeper into the quiet. The sound of the Aven is there, if you want it. That layered, contemplative murmur of water over stone, moving with such unhurried certainty through the dark. The Silvaneth breathe around you, their slow luminescence warming the air just slightly. Above you, though you cannot see them through closed eyes, the stars of the starfield of the living are burning in their patient, permanent way, sending their light down through the dark as they have always done, into the stones, into the rivers, into every living thing, into you. There is nothing you need to do with this. You only need to breathe and let it be true, and let the night do what the night has always done, quietly and without fuss, in the way of things that have been practicing for a very long time, in and out, and in and out. The valley is still. Carador's fire has settled to embers, warm and deep, and the cottage holds the day's warmth the way good stone holds warmth, slowly releasing it back into the air throughout the night. The moss is cool and soft beneath the trees. The river moves. The stars burn. You are exactly where you are. And where you are is good. Rest now. Just rest. If this story brought you any peace tonight, if it gave your mind somewhere soft to go, please consider sharing it with someone who might need a quiet place to rest. And if you'd like more stories from Astral Sleep Stories, more worlds, more wandering, more evenings beside ancient rivers under patient stars, you can find us here on this channel. A like and a subscription means these stories can find the people who need them, and there is nothing we would rather do than that. Good night. Sleep well. The stars are burning. They always are.